Blokes birthed the Bible, and men mediated its meaning for many a generation. But today that's not the point I'm making. It was also written by Homo sapiens, by you and by me, or at least by creatures with our ancestry. Sapiens wrote the scripture. Get the picture? So we have Genesis 1, how it all begun. Let us make man in our image, have dominion and subdue. To Genesis 9, where God says to Noah, I give it all to you. Woohoo! But what is a tree-hugging Christian to do? Well, we can dredge up Genesis 2, the Adam from the Adamah, human from the humus, created not to own and rule, but serve and protect. And yet, serve is translated till. And that was probably the intention. This story may be very, very old, but it was compiled after the invention of agriculture. Turn that horrible scrub to garden, swamp to paddock, filling larders, settling down, claiming titles, erecting fences, mine and yours, my land, my animals, my women. Yep, blokes birthed the Bible and men mediated its meaning. And humans did the writing, and humans do the reading. But because some women worked really hard and long with a few male supporters, the church eventually started to hear their song, and especially that of their daughters. So perhaps all the other species can get a look in too, not just as pets or produce or food or glue, but as much a part of God's story as me and you. Of course, they can't work at it hard and long, so it's down to us, their supporters, to sing their song. That's from a book which hopefully by the time you're watching this might actually even be available. I think it's going to be called I'm Not a Racist, but I've Got a Racist Butt. Anyway, for it's written in the law of Moses, you shall not muzzle an ox while it's treading down the grain. But is it for oxen that God is concerned? Or is he not speaking entirely for our sake? Of course it was written for our sake. So said the Apostle Paul anyway to the Corinthians around about the time of the birth of Christianity, which went on to have an impact to everybody who's watching this now. It doesn't actually matter whether you're a Christian or not. Christianity has influenced this nation now called Australia profoundly. I grew up knowing that I wanted to help animals, maybe as a vet or a marine biologist, which eventually led me to an honours in zoology. But then there was an apparent about turn as I entered the world of faith and found myself studying and candidating to be a minister in the Uniting Church, ordained as a deacon. And deacons in the Uniting Church are ordained to help the church work for and alongside the marginalised and the oppressed to bring about justice, which for me includes the 99.99999% of creatures which aren't human beings and that are also marginalised in just about all of the decision making that Homo sapiens undertake. So tonight I'm really sad not to be with you in Adelaide. I've got some good friends down there that I would have loved to catch up with, but I'm still glad to be able to be with you even by video. I hope to stretch you and to be stretched by you as we get into some discussion tonight. The short reflection that I'm going to share with you now uses the Uniting Church as a case study, but I think it's broadly applicable. So the first idea to look at is androcentrism, or man-centeredness. Blokes birthed the Bible and men for millennia mediated its meaning. And so they should, of course, according to the author of Timothy, appealing to Genesis and backed up by church fathers for centuries ever after. Even those few churches that now fully accept women's ordination and leadership acknowledge that the later New Testament writings reflect a steady shift towards the subordination of women. So there are some passages like Galatians 3:28 and Acts 18 which seem to place men and women as equals, and others like 1 Timothy which undermine that. And the church for centuries went with the latter emphasis, so that to ordain women now is to admit that the New Testament does not speak with one voice on the issues of women and men in the church. Even Paul seems to find himself pulled in different directions. And to claim that therefore even vulnerable church traditions must be subjected to continual critical critique in the light of the gospel. And we found it vital to do this critique because unless we properly understand the relationship between women and men, we won't be able to act properly. No matter how benignly men might have treated women or decided to treat women, if they saw themselves as fundamentally superior and more important, then that would be a permanent blight on their relationship and the relationship of each of them to God. I wonder if you agree with that. Or if you're a woman and this next question is just for the women, are you happy to be patronised and belittled as long as you aren't actually abused? So it seems to me that Christians who have engaged with this critique of androcentrism in the light of the scriptures and church tradition are well placed to respond to Lynn White's accusation back in the late 60s that Western Christianity, because of its biblical roots, is the most anthropocentric religion the world has ever known, or human-centred. What does it mean that the Bible and most of Christianity and most of Western history wasn't just written and interpreted by men, but all of it was written and interpreted by human beings? So our second ism, anthropocentrism, or human-centeredness. And Christian anthropocentrism includes the assumption that humans are the centre of the story of God and life. At least that's the way I'll be using the word. Drawing on Genesis 1, a common form of Christian anthropocentrism assumes that human beings alone bear the image of God, have been charged with dominion over the earth, and given the earth and its creatures as a possession, by the time we get to Genesis 8 in particular. In Genesis 8, all things are delivered into our hands, or technically the men's. An increasingly common and apparently more ecologically friendly form of anthropocentrism tones down dominion in favour of Genesis 2 with its positioning of humans as the servants or the farmers and the protectors of God's garden. This gives us a far humbler but still absolutely pivotal role in the story of God and life, especially as it's connected with the theology of the fall in Genesis 3. It includes other species as players in the story of God and life, but still human beings are in the starring role. We could take the Uniting Church again as a case study. Our founding document envisages a final reconciliation and renewal of the whole creation, not just human beings. Yet in our first Station to the Nation, released at the same time, we said we affirm our eagerness to uphold basic Christian values and principles, such as the importance of every human being, and a concern for the welfare of the whole human race. We're concerned with the basic human rights of future generations, and will urge the wise use of energy, the protection of the environment, and the replenishment of the Earth's resources for their use and enjoyment. In other words, creation is stuff for humans to share, even though they should share it fairly. A decade later, non-humans were given a small role, but humans were still the centre, when we said we affirm our belief that the natural world is God's creation, good in God's eyes, good in itself, and good for sustaining human life. And the Uniting Church really hasn't moved beyond putting humans in the starring role of the story of God and creation. A consensus, even amongst people who'd like to actually do that, seems to be that it's too contentious to try and challenge the Christian belief that humans are the centre of God's concern. It'd be as unpopular as Galileo telling us we're not the centre of the universe. And that we should instead focus on getting people to do something about the ecological crisis, instead of fundamentally make them rethink their relationship to the rest of the earth. What do you think? Is it more important to get people to believe the right thing or to do the right thing? For me, I question whether we really can, in an ongoing way, do the right thing or do enough if ultimately we think it's all about us. If men needed to understand the relationship between men and women and between women and God properly, in order to have a proper relationship, then do humans also need to understand properly their relationship to other creatures and the relationship of other creatures to God? And if so, if we need a revolution in our view of ourselves to act properly in the world, can we truly hope to escape our self-centeredness as a species and learn to read the scripture with ecological eyes? Can humanity, in other words, do what some men have struggled to do since feminism, and hear the voice of another, see God's relationship with another, in scriptures written and interpreted mostly by them? Well, I reckon we can, at least a bit. A few years back, Vicky Balabansky was the South Australian contributor to an online conference that I ran called The Bible and Ecology. And you can still watch those videos, as well as the ones on Christ and creation and Hope in Action. My talk at that conference goes through a number of scientific lenses which can help us to read the scripture with ecological eyes, like cosmology and geology and evolution and ecology and so on. There's also the resource that comes from a very significant gaggle of South Australians, many of whom are with us tonight, who produced and or contributed to the Earth Bible Commentary series, which is summarised for us plebs in the Season of Creation Preaching Commentary. That commentary is a fantastic resource if you want to participate in the season of creation, which Norm Harble and the Vic Tas Synod spearheaded, and many South Australians helped get off the ground. For the rest of this evening, I'm not going to go through all of those scientific lenses. I want to go back to a different metaphor from the poem I started with, the metaphor of singing, of listening to those who are singing the earth song. And I just want to focus in on a couple of possibilities for you tonight. So I'm assuming that it's not enough just to end the abuse of women. We need to shift the thinking which casts women as in an inferior role to men, in themselves, in their relationship to men, and in their relationship to God. Benign paternalism is better than abuse, but it's not nearly good enough. And therefore I'm claiming that the same is true for the other creatures we share the planet with. They aren't just stuff for us to divvy up. They aren't always a backdrop to the real story. Instead, we're a tiny part of the story of life, and the story of God and life. At the very least, we're surrounded by non-human neighbours. But really, I want to argue, we're part of the huge family of life, and many of us are acting like some kind of spoilt prodigal child in need of some repentance and humility. How do we hear the song of our neighbours, our brothers and our sisters, and how are we going to sing it? Well, we'll do a bit of that listening now, and then I hope when you return to the scriptures tomorrow or in the conversation after this presentation, and for the rest of your lives, you'll be able to do it in a way which helps you read it with those songs singing in your ears. So tonight we're going to look at a very small sampling of some people already singing the song. We'll start with you. We'll look at what some scientists are saying in terms of animals as our neighbours, in terms of climate change and the fires and the barrier reef, and also the suggestion that animals aren't just our neighbours but our kin. Then we'll be hearing from some Aboriginal Christian leaders talking about the earth as our mother and other animals as our kin. And we'll be hearing from Pastor Ray Minikin and Brooke Prentice, who's the CEO of Common Grace. So the question for you, you can see there in the poll, it's a deliberately open question. So let's look at what the scientists are saying. Well, here's a very, very simplified graph of something that comes from the United Nations Emissions Gap Report, which shows that we're basically on the brink of missing any chance of keeping global warming to 1.5 degrees. And in fact, the current Paris commitments would see us reaching 3.2 degrees or so, and that's probably being conservative. In other words, we need a 76% reduction of our current global emissions by 2030 if we're going to have any chance of sticking to 1.5 degrees of warming. And if you don't already know why there's such a big difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees of warming, we can talk more about that later. But when you remember that we've already had 1 degree of warming, then the difference between 1.5 and 2 is basically a doubling from where we are now. Who is my neighbour? Well, I want to argue my neighbour is whoever is or could be affected by my actions. Ecologically, we are neighbours to all other species because there's no other species on Earth which isn't affected by what we do. Scientists are saying that the North Coast koala population up where I live in New South Wales probably suffered about 70% of population losses during the bushfires that we just had. But again, on the ground surveys in the last month have suggested that that's too conservative as well, and it could be even higher. Just in New South Wales and Victoria, well over 1 billion other vertebrates died. And if you're in South Australia, you'd know about the massive fires through Kangaroo Island. That's echidnas, wombats, possums, gliders, kangaroos, wallabies, rat kangaroos, bandicoots, antechinus, dunarts, and other carnivorous mammals. Mice, rats, snakes, lizards, birds. It excludes all the bats and the platypus and the frogs and the fish and the insects, so the tally is well over 1 billion creatures. The survivors face burns, inhalation damage, starvation, and dying of thirst. In the mid-north coast, beekeepers had to stop sending their staff out to check on the hives after the fires because the screams of animals in pain and torment was too much for them to bear. Apocalypse is a fair word for what happened in the Australian bush recently. And people are responding to their neighbour in need, like this koala, with charity. There was a massive outpouring of charity towards other creatures. But few of us are demanding justice. We might talk later about what is justice for our non-human neighbours. I'll throw that to you a bit later on. Since 2016-17, with the coral bleachings, there's been a 90% drop in new coral survival rate on the Barrier Reef. And the Barrier Reef just went through its third major coral bleaching outbreak in the space of 5 years, because the high ocean temperatures didn't drop when we were hoping they would. This has just happened. It's continuing to unfold even now. Most of the reef is already half to 1 degree above average, and some parts are 3 degrees above average. So this is our neighbour, billions of coral and hundreds of millions of creatures who depend on it, on the brink of devastation as we live and breathe and talk together tonight. Even the government can't keep that under wraps. According to the Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority, climate change impacts on coral reefs are predicted to worsen and critically affect the survival of coral reefs globally without the strongest possible climate change mitigation. So that's neighbour. Humans are affecting all other animals. They are our neighbours. According to the theories of evolution and the study of genetics, we are one big family as well. This picture here is the river of life. It's mostly microbial to start with, and you can kind of see towards the end, in what looks like a bit of a head with 2 arms, there's 3 streams of life: the animals, the microbes and the plants. And that tiny little yellow dot there is us human beings here on the planet at this moment. Animals will continue long after we're extinct, and microbes will continue long after that. If we had a ruler and the entire existence of our species was represented by just 1 centimetre, then we would need, so from 1 centimetre for us, we'd need 20 centimetres to tell the story of Homo sapiens. We'd need 400 metres to tell the story of life on Earth. The story from Jesus to now would be 1/20th of 1 millimetre. It's a massive challenge to Western Christianity, the most anthropocentric religion the world has ever known. Most of God's relationship with and love of creation and interaction with creation has had absolutely nothing to do with human beings. We are a new member of the family, and many of us are still acting like the prodigal son before his conversion. If you want to find out more about that, you can read the very long PhD on biocentric theology, or a few reflections based on the PhD, which I shared with the Adelaide Eco-Faith community back when I was a minister in Adelaide, what seems like ages ago, about a decade ago, called Worshipping Evolution's God. And the astute observer will notice that I've only actually ever produced 1 artwork in my entire life, which I use for everything. If we're looking for a metaphor, so this koala, well, she's certainly our neighbour because our actions affect her. But how do you feel about saying that she is our sister, or at least a cousin? She is literally a genetic relative if you go back 100 million years or so. So much for metaphors. She's also quite literally, at least as I see it, a person, because a person is someone with personality, which means that well over 1 billion people died in those summer fires. More died of burns and thirst and starvation in January. And we get that this koala is a person to some extent when the fires draw our attention to her. But when our attention drifts away again to talk of logging quotas and timber salvage in burned areas, then she becomes stuff again. I flagged before, and we might circle back to it later, she gets charity during the fires, but will she get justice if she survives them? And what is justice for non-human people? Now, we're going to hear briefly from some Aboriginal singers. In the Uniting Church context, back in 1977, when the church started, the church as a whole, as I said, was still talking about creation as stuff for us to share. But the Aboriginal delegates of the Northern Territory Synod, when they talked about uranium mining, said this: "We're deeply concerned about the damage it will have on our mother land and to her children, the Aboriginal people. We strongly believe that the land is part of our being. It's within our bones. Digging our land is digging something that's inside us." We have this fantastic video by Pastor Ray Minikin that you can look at if you go to unitingearth.org.au, but I'll just read you a couple of quotes from that video tonight. "The trees and the animals and the stars and the moon and the rocks and the landscape are all part of our family. brothers and sisters. And that God has created, all that God has created is good for all of us. We prefer the word creator, the one who made everything. It's a better starting point for us. Then we can see that we are all related. Every life form is part of what God created. Yet we have sinned and destroyed so much. Jesus didn't just come to save me from my sins, that's so minute, but to save the whole universe. Salvation to me is not just how do we save ourselves, but how do we save the bloomin' planet, God's creation. And a word from Brooke Prentice, who's the CEO of Common Grace, which also makes her my boss. I work a day a week for Common Grace in the climate area. This is what Brooke said in a reflection on God's beautiful earth for the season of creation a couple of years ago.
Each morning, I walk along the seashore and watch the sunrise. I see pelicans glide onto the water surface, see fish jump into the air from the sea, and a green sea turtle raise its head above the water. I listen to rainbow lorikeets partying in the bottlebrush flowers, hear the Australian pied oyster catcher as they forage through the rocks, and hear magpies warble, "Good morning." I pay attention to the words spoken by the waves gently crashing on the shore, the splashes on the rocks, and the gentle breeze through the she-oaks and the gum trees. I listen deeply. I've always known that one listens with their whole body, ears, eyes, heart, mind, and spirit. Some people know this as the ancient Aboriginal practice of Didiri. Didiri, there is a word for it in each Aboriginal nation, but the work of Auntie Miriam Rose Unganabarman has put Didiri on the map. Auntie Miriam Rose says this: Didiri is also used as a prayer in the sense of you just feel the presence of the great creator. Aboriginal peoples have lived for thousands of years with nature's quietness. My people today recognize and experience in this quietness the great life-giving spirit, the Father of us all. That's Auntie Miriam Rose. You see, our dreaming stories are thousands of years of law and living, passed down from the Creator, passed to the first generation, and then to the next, and to the next, and to the next generations. The dreaming teaches us about the Creator, how to care for creation, and how to live in right relationship with one another. The dreaming still has so much to teach us, Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal peoples today. But ask the animals, and they will teach you, or the birds in the sky, and they will tell you, or speak to the earth, and it will teach you, or let the fish in the sea inform you. Which of all these does not know that the hand of the Lord has done this? In his hand is the life of every creature, and the breath of all mankind. Job 12:7-10 reminds us that the animals, the birds, the earth, the fish, and indeed the ocean, sky, land, and rivers, all of God's wondrous creation are connected, precious, to be cared for, and can teach, tell, speak, and inform us. Aboriginal peoples have always known this and been living out our Creator-appointed roles as caretakers of these lands and waters, now called Australia, for thousands of years. For us as Aboriginal peoples, there is no separation between human and non-human. We have lived sustainably using only what God provided, never taking too much and never taking anything to scarcity or extinction. When we look at the damage and the destruction of the last 225 to 250 years, we know we must come together, Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal peoples, and we must use our hands, feet, and voices to do better. As Aboriginal peoples, we hear our lands screaming, weeping, and crying out. We hear it in the Torres Strait Islands, watching the seas rise. We hear it in Warlpiri country, sitting in the hot desert sun. We hear it in Wurundjeri country, from the winds on the mountains. It is the voice of great Creator Spirit, Almighty God, Papa, Jesus. Come alongside us, learn from God's appointed caretakers, and together let's act and protect God's wondrous creation in these lands we now call Australia, and in God's beautiful earth.
Another question for you. What do you reckon? Are koalas and other creatures people? Can we legitimately call them people? I thought I'd finish with another poem from the book called The Chimp's Koran, with apologies to Dr. Seuss and really to poetry lovers everywhere. I guess I've been trying to sing the song, to use that metaphor, of other creatures, sometimes tunefully, as long as I can remember, inspired by people like James Herriot and Harry Butler and the Leyland brothers and David Attenborough and Diane Fossey. I sang it squeakily to some people ravaging our local reef in my late teens, and after briefly getting lost in some very big C conservative evangelical heavenism, which Norm Harville will be happy to tell you all about, at my conversion to Christianity in my 20s, I've been privileged since then to be supported by the church for about a quarter of a century nearly, to continue to sing the song of creation with other people and to encourage them to sing along too. I first tried to put that to rhyme in this homage to other creatures on Dr. Seuss back in the 90s, and haven't had a chance to improve it. 'Twas a lovely day, full of the birds and the bees buzzing around the new truffler trees, and I chatted to God as I wended my way, promising we'd all be good stewards one day, for we knew that our dominion meant compassion, not bashin'. Then I wandered and wandered down Cricklewood Lane, where I met a small fellow who may well be insane. But I promised I'd tell you what the mangy chap said, so I'm writing it now while it's still in my head. He said, I am the Lorax, I speak for the trees, I speak for the trees have no tongue, and I'm asking you, sir, at the top of my lungs, just for once use your brain and undone what you've done. Your thinking is muddled and terribly wrong. You think you're more special than the old swammy swans. I know you mean well, but it won't last for long unless you can make all your thinking unwrong. I know that you know that God's not a man and that men aren't the centre of God's little plan. God's not on the side of the ruling classes and colour's just colour with no special passes. You suspect the right spots in the biblical books, but there's one thing that you have overly looked. The whole thing is biased. It's thoroughly proven. It wasn't just written by men, but by humans. I know you mean well and you just want to help and be a good steward and save the kelp and live up to the calling you've had from your birth, made in God's image to care for the earth. But you're wrongety, wrong. You say you're made in God's image, not God. You think you're a little lower than the angels. You think you've got first place at God's table. If only you could read the tortoise Bible, the chimp's Quran, the orangutan's flower, you would see that everyone thinks they're the best, that they are more special than all of the rest. Now I see you look flummoxed and angry and sad, but the news that I've newsed you with isn't all bad. Remember the thing that you know most profound. God has more than enough love to go round. Only infants need to be most special and best. Maturity helps us to value the rest. If the brown barbaloots are as special as you, it doesn't mean you need to feel blue, and it doesn't mean there's nothing to do. All it means is you're not top of the heap. Your creaturely neighbours don't have lives that are cheap. Save them, of course, give them room to grow, be a good neighbour, don't get carried away with your plans for expansion, you'll be compost one day. Love God, love your neighbour, do as you'd have done to you. That's still the crux. I add nothing new. Just remember your neighbour isn't just you.